this is section 7. We're going to talk about the offshoring model. And then at the end, I'm going to go into a little bit of a discussion and hopefully open things up and ask you sort of what you think about the offshoring model and also how it compares to some of the models that we've seen previously. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So you've seen this already in lecture, but today what we're going to consider is we're going to consider what happens if the cost of offshoring tasks from home to foreign is going to decrease, both theoretically and then also with the numerical exercise. And the basic upshot of the offshoring model is fairly straightforward, is that when we find that offshoring costs are lower, then firms are going to try to do more offshoring. And so as long as they're able to engage in offshoring, then more offshoring is going to be done. And so sort of this model of offshoring is going to change the relative demand for high-skilled workers for both countries. And I think it has a really sort of nice and sort of surprising result about demand for high-skilled workers in both countries. Namely, that if you have offshoring of low-skilled tasks from the high-skilled country to a low-skilled country, from the high-skilled country's perspective, then the low-skilled tasks that are leaving are relatively low skill, whereas from the low skill country's perspective, those tasks that are arriving are actually relatively high skill. And so I think that's an interesting and surprising result, and I'll come back to that later. And so this is what I was saying earlier. If home is going to offshore the least skill intensive activities, then that's going to mean that they're going to produce goods that are now more skill intensive than before. And so you have this sort of perspective where home is giving up the least skilled task, and foreign's gaining actually from its perspective more skilled tasks. And so we're going to find that it's going to increase the relative demand for skilled labor in both countries, and therefore the skill premium, which recall is just the wage of skilled workers over the wage of unskilled workers, is going to increase in both countries. So that's just a recap, but I'm going to dive into an example and show you how that works. And as I always like to say, like if you have any questions, feel free to jump in. So there's a question in the chat that I'm looking at now. If the slide is posted on bCourses, I don't have the slides posted yet on bCourses. I was going to post them tomorrow, but would it be helpful for you? I could pause the pause for a little bit and post them right on bCourses if people would want. Yeah, I can do that. Okay. So just a little bit of a refresher on the offshoring model. We're going to think, and I think this is important just to come back to, because there's some questions that sort of ask you like how many tasks get offshored. And it's important to note that when we're thinking about the offshoring model, we're thinking about offshoring of like the production of intermediate goods. And what an intermediate good is it's a good that's used in the production of final goods. And so you could think of various things, but you could think of, for instance, think of the production process for airplanes. Airplanes are going to require sheet metal, they're going to require engines, they're going to require a bunch of rivets, computer systems, and all the things like that. So intermediate goods are the goods that we use to then produce final goods that are then directly sold to consumers. And so when we're thinking about the offshoring model, we're thinking about not necessarily offshoring the whole, the production of the final good that gets sold to consumers, although certainly that happens too. In this model, what we're thinking of is we're thinking about intermediate good production. And so you can imagine that say I have an industry, say I'm thinking about computers, then I have a whole lot of sort of intermediate goods that I need to produce that task of finishing computers. So if we think about Apple, Apple's a good example because it sort of sells its final goods as computers across the world, obviously, but also here locally in the U.S. And it uses intermediate goods from all around the world: computer chips, LCD screens, or I think they might be LED screens at this point. But you get my point. Sort of metals, but then it sort of combines all of those to make a final good. And so you could think that each of these intermediate goods that we're going to use to produce a final good, we can arrange as a continuum. And what we're going to think is we're going to think that this continuum is going to reflect the degree of sort of high or low skill specialization of each of those tasks. So if we just think about all of the intermediate goods that could go into our production process, and we line them up in terms of having 0 be the lowest skilled task and 1 be the highest skilled task, then we sort of rank each of those tasks with alpha, which is somewhere between 0 and 1. And as I said earlier, what we're thinking is that the closer you move to 1, then the more skill intensive that task is going to be. And so we're gonna call basically we're gonna sort of make an assumption about what the production function is going to look like for each of these, for the production of each of these intermediate goods, and it's going to be some function of high skilled labor. It's going to be some function of low skilled labor. And then, of course, it's going to be indexed by how high skill or low skill it is. And so this production function, we may not have seen before in this class. This is called a Leontief production function. And basically what it says is that it's going to take the minimum of one of these two arguments. So whichever one of these arguments is smaller, that's going to be what the production is equal to. And so we're going to take the minimum of either LH over alpha or LL over 1 minus alpha. And so the idea is that, say, if LH over alpha is less than or equal to LL over 1 minus alpha, then we're going to have that Q here is going to be equal to LH over alpha. Likewise, if this term, we have that instead, we have that LL over 1 minus alpha is less than or equal to LH over alpha, then this production function is telling us that Q is equal to LL over 1 minus alpha. And so this is what our Leontief production function looks like. So it's not nearly as confusing as it looks. And so you can sort of see here that what's going to be the optima is because because this production function takes the minimum of these two arguments, then, for instance, if I have that I'm hiring, say, suppose that I'm hiring a lot more low-skilled labor than high-skilled labor, and I have this, and I'm in the situation where this term is greater than this term, then that's meaning that I'm hiring too many low-skilled workers, and I would be better off if I'd hire more high-skilled workers, because hiring additional low-skilled workers doesn't give me any additional production. And so at optimum, we're going to want to hire low and high skilled labor such that LH over alpha is equal to LL over alpha, or this condition right here. So in particular, what we can think about is we can think about how much high and low skilled labor we're going to want to hire when we're producing 1 unit of our intermediate good. And so when we produce 1 unit of our intermediate good, then we need to have that LH over alpha is equal to 1, and LL over 1 minus alpha, is equal to 1. So what this implies is it just implies that LH is equal to alpha and LL is equal to 1 minus alpha. And so just to produce one unit of the good, we're going to want to produce, we're going to need to use alpha units of LH at optimum, and LL equals 1 minus alpha units of low skilled labor at optimum. And then if we just want to think about how much we were going to need to hire to say make two units of the good, or 3 or 4, then we just could multiply both of these terms by Q, and that would tell us how much high and low skilled labor we want to hire at optimum. Okay, so then what we can do is we can just derive the unit cost of producing an activity that's indexed with skill intensity alpha. And what the unit cost means is it's just a way of saying the cost to produce 1 unit. And so if we think about the cost to produce 1 unit, well, we already said that if we're hiring labor optimally, we're going to hire alpha units of high skilled labor and 1 minus alpha units of, oh, this is a typo here. Sorry, I apologize. 1 minus alpha units of low skilled labor. And so then if suppose that low skilled labor earns a wage, or sorry, excuse me, if high skilled workers earn a wage WH and low skilled workers earn a wage WL, and so this is the wage for low skilled workers, then I hope it's fairly straightforward to see that the unit cost, so the cost of producing 1 unit of an intermediate good indexed by alpha is then just going to be alpha WH plus 1 minus alpha WL. Does anyone have any questions about this? Okay, cool. So what we're going to consider is we're going to consider 2 countries, Morocco and France, and I think Morocco and France are two examples of countries that where France has traditionally offshored some tasks to Morocco, but I'm not entirely positive about that, but it seems like that would make sense. And then what we're going to do is we're going to suppose that wages in these countries were tabulated as below, and so we're going to assume that France has both a higher low skilled wage and a higher high skilled wage, but the sort of you can see that immediately that the relative difference between the high skilled wage and the low skilled wage in Morocco is going to be bigger, and so we're going to end up seeing that Morocco has a higher wage premium. So I sort of asked question. I already was answering question 1, and question 1 is going to ask which country has a higher wage for high skilled labor, and if offshoring is possible, which country do you expect to specialize in high skill intensive activities, and which country did in low skill intensive activities? And so I was kind of already getting there, but you know, if we wanted to figure out, for instance, what's the wage premium, then the wage premium is then just, or the wage premium, or excuse me, the skill premium is just taken by taking WH over WL. And so this is the skill premium. And when we just plug in numbers for Morocco, we find that Morocco has a skill premium of 4 and France has a skill premium of 2. And so high skilled workers relative to low skilled workers in Morocco earn a wage that's 4 times higher, whereas the same is only double in France. And so what that's going to mean is that the relative price of high skilled work in Morocco is twice as expensive as it is in France. And so the thinking that you should have is like, suppose that I wanted to hire a high skilled worker in Morocco, then you know I would have to pay them 4. But if I were to hire the same low skilled workers, then I could hire 4 low skilled workers for the same price. And so relative to France, if conditional on hiring a high skilled worker in Morocco, I give up relatively more hours of work that low skilled workers can provide me than I would in France. And so the opportunity cost of hiring a high skilled worker in Morocco is higher. And this is a fairly similar argument to what we saw with comparative advantage. In fact, it's identical. And so what we'd have, the only difference here is that the inequality is different. And so the country that has the higher skill premium, and so since Morocco has the higher skill premium, that's going to mean that it's going to specialize in low skill intensive activities, whereas France, which has the lower skill premium, is going to specialize in high skill intensive activities, and for the reason that I just stated. But it's not that one point that I like that I like that's made is that it's not that there's not high skilled workers in Morocco. There are plenty of high skilled workers in Morocco. It's just that relative to a high skilled worker, low skilled labor is relatively cheaper, and so with the same amount of money spent on your wage bill, you could hire more low skilled workers in Morocco instead than you could in France. And I think that's an interesting way to think about sort of returns to education in both countries. Does anyone have any questions about this? Okay, I'll keep moving on. So what we're going to assume is we're going to assume that there's offshoring costs t equals 2. And then for any activity with skill activity alpha, we're going to ask what's going to be the unit cost of production for a French company in France. And then subsequently, we're going to think of if the French company were to offshore that skill activity alpha to Morocco, what's going to be the unit cost of production there? And so from before, we're just going to take the unit cost function that we had before. And so this is going to be the same. But all we're going to do is we're just going to take this unit cost function and just plug in for what we've assumed about high and low skilled wages in France. And so what this should give us is this should give us that the cost of producing, say, activity alpha in France is going to be equal to alpha times 6 plus 1 minus alpha times 3. And then to simplify, we're just going to take alpha times 6 plus 3 minus 3 alpha. And then what that gives us is it gives us 3 alpha plus 3. And so that's what the slides say. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to figure out the same just by plugging in again what Morocco's wages we assumed were going to be. And so this is going to be 1. Oh, sorry, excuse me. This is going to be 4, and then this is going to be 1. And so then what we get is we get 4 alpha plus 1 minus alpha. And so what that ends up giving us is it gives us 3 alpha plus 1. So for here, just to derive the unit cost of production, we're just going to plug in for what we've assumed about wages. However, if we want to think about, say, the unit cost for a French firm in Morocco, well, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to take the unit cost of producing, say, that good in Morocco, and then multiply it by the offshoring costs. And the reason that we're going to sort of think about them, about multiplying the offshoring costs, is that we're going to think that, for instance, the way you can think about it is you can think that there's going to be some set of, and I think the easiest way to see this is suppose that there are tariffs from receiving a good from Morocco in France. Well, what a tariff acts like is it acts in an ad valorem way, where it just takes the total cost of the good and then multiplies it by a certain percent. And so in this case, if the tariff was, say, 100%, that would be equivalent to having offshoring costs of 2. And so we just take whatever the cost is in Morocco, and then to export it back to France, for instance, whatever the cost was in Morocco just doubles. And that's because of either shipping charges, the cost of Morocco speaks French, but there could be things like the cost of having to find a translator to work in a different country. It could be tariffs, things like that. And so these offshoring costs are going to reflect the additional costs of choosing to sort of to do your business in another place, but they're going to multiply whatever the cost was in Morocco. And so in particular, it's just going to be, we said that here t is going to be 2. And so this 2 is just going to multiply the cost of doing business in Morocco. And so in particular, we're going to get that TCM alpha, or the cost for a French firm operating in Morocco, is just going to be 6 alpha plus 2. And so hopefully the slides should say the same. So yeah, the slides say the same, and I'll just erase all my scribbles here. So we just take Morocco's unit cost, multiply it by T, and that gives us that. So now we know basically the cost of producing a good domestically, and then the cost of, from the perspective of France, offshoring a good to Morocco, and then bringing it back to France so that it can be domestically consumed. And so we're now just going to ask, like, okay, we've lined up all of these production activities from low to high skill. Let's figure out whether or not they're going to perform different varieties of certain tasks, either domestically or abroad. And so all we're going to do here is we're going to ask, an activity with alpha equal to 1/10, is that going to be performed in France or Morocco? And we're going to ask the same for an activity with skill intensity given by 9/10. And so all we're going to do here is we're just going to plug in for alpha, and I can do the math. It's not super. It doesn't really add a ton of intuition or anything. It's just you just have to sort of plug in and do the math. Plus 3, so that gives us 3 times 1/10, gives us 3/10. Then this becomes 30/10, and so then we get 33/10. Just the, but again, plugging in for these alphas isn't super. It doesn't really illuminate much intuition. You just have to plug in and do things out, and so then we get 20/10, and so again we get 26/10. We can simplify this to be 3.3, and here this is going to be 2.6. And so when we're comparing production costs, sometimes I think I think there's a natural tendency just to look at the larger number and say larger is better. I think just in life we have that natural tendency. But in this case, you want to find where production costs are lower. And I'm just describing a mistake that I sometimes make when I think about this myself. But in this case, a firm wants to minimize its cost, and so it's going to look for where production is cheaper. And so in this case, a French firm will offshore the task that corresponds to alpha equal to 0.1 or 1/10. So that's how you'd solve for that. And then we can do the same with 0.9. In this case, I'm just going to let the slides do the math for us. And if anyone wants me to do the math out, I'm happy to do that myself. But we can see here that the cost of production for a higher skill task, because recall that we sort of lined up these tasks from sort of low to high skill. So the cost for this higher skill task corresponding to 0.9 is now cheaper in France, and so the French firm will, because it wants to minimize costs, will produce domestically, or so it will produce alpha, the task corresponding to alpha 0.9 domestically. And so, I think one way to do it, a sort of a terribly inefficient way to sort of figure this out, would just be to try a different range of values, see which ones will be offshored or not, and then sort of infer roughly, where the sort of break-even point is. But it's far easier just to then sort of solve for the alpha such that the costs of both producing in France and then offshoring the production task will be the same. And that way we can, because all the tasks have been lined up for high to low skill, then that point at that alpha, all of the tasks that are above that alpha are then higher skill. And so the tasks that are higher than our alpha will not be offshored, they'll be produced domestically. And then the tasks that are less than that alpha will be offshored. And so we're trying to find that critical value. And so that's what we're being asked to do in question 4. So this is sort of stating this again here. So recall that a French firm is going to offshore an activity to Morocco if the trade cost, the cost of the unit cost of producing in Morocco is less than the unit cost of producing in France, including trade costs. So so what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically then plug in for all of this what I found before. So recall from before that we had that the trade cost inclusive cost of producing a good with skill intensity alpha in Morocco was 6 alpha plus 2. And if I'm recalling correctly, the cost of producing a task with skill alpha in France was equal to 3 alpha plus 3. And so what I'm going to do is then I'm going to set these equal, and I'm going to solve for which alpha, what alpha equates those two costs, such that French firms would be totally indifferent between producing that good in Morocco or in France. And so all we have to do here is just a little bit of algebra. So I'm just going to subtract 3 alpha on both sides, and I'm going to subtract by 2 on both sides. So these cancel, and then what I'm left with is 3 alpha equal to 1. And so just by dividing by 3 on both sides, I get that alpha must be equal to 1/3. And so recall that I said that because we've lined up the tasks in a row, any alpha that's for alpha that's greater than 1/3, this is going to be produced domestically, because anything that's higher than this is a higher skill task, and so this is produced in France. And then every alpha that's less than 1/3 is going to be produced in Morocco. Sometimes I get questions about what happens to the good that's exactly equal to 1/3. And I have 2 answers. The one thing that you could say is that, suppose that the production cost of producing a good in France, from the perspective of a French firm, suppose that the cost of producing a good in France is exactly equal in producing it in Morocco and in France. Well, one thing you could think of is, there might be some home bias insofar as French firms, if the costs are, they're totally these totally ruthless capitalists, and so as soon as the cost is even 1 cent cheaper abroad, they'll offshore like that. They're the French firms are they're consulting with Bain and Company, and so they'll sort of offshore immediately as soon as the cost is even marginally lower. But maybe they have some home bias, and so as long as the cost is just break even, exactly equal, these firms will choose to produce in France. And so that's one answer to the question of what happens to this sort of break even good. You can call it, produced in France if you like. But another answer, and I think this is sort of a little bit more mathy of an answer, is that we're thinking about lining up tasks from 0 to 1, and in this model we think that there's basically an infinite number of tasks between 0 and 1, because you can split up the real numbers between 0 and 1 sort of infinitely. And so this task is sort of infinitesimally small, and so we don't have to worry too much about that one. But that's sort of more of a mathematical argument. But if it sort of makes more economic sense, you can just say that the sort of good that just equalizes the unit cost of producing in France or Morocco is going to be produced domestically. So these slides are going to say exactly what I just said. Okay, so now what we're going to assume is that the offshoring costs are going to fall to t equals 1.5 or 3/2. And we're going to ask what the new unit cost of production for a French company offshoring the activity to Morocco is going to be. And then for what values of alpha would an activity with high skill intensity alpha be offshored by French companies. And so this is just the same thing. All we need to do is now sort of recompute the unit cost of production in Morocco, a task with skill intensity alpha. And so recall from before that the cost of producing a task with skill intensity alpha was 3 alpha plus 1. Before this was 2, but now this is 3 over 2. And so now the only thing we're going to change is we're going to plug in for that new t. And oops, sorry. And so what that, and then we'll then sort of factor that out. And so what that's going to give us is going to give us 9 halves alpha plus 3 halves plus 3 halves. Okay, and so then that's going to be the new unit cost of production for a French company offshoring the activity in Morocco. So we've answered the first part of the question. And then all we have to do is we have to then again find that sort of break-even alpha where the cost of producing in Morocco for a French firm is the same as if it were to produce domestically. And so again, what we're going to do is we're just going to set this all equal to the cost of producing alpha in France. And I am recalling that that's 3 alpha plus 3. Again, so now all we have to do here is we just have to do a bit of algebra. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to subtract 3 alpha from both sides. And when I subtract 3 alpha from both sides, I'm actually going to write this as 6 over 2, but that's the same as 3 alpha, just to sort of make that the same as this. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 3 over 2 from both sides and just replace this with 6 over 2. So it helps make the math easier. And then again, I have to subtract 6 over 2 alpha from both sides. So these cancel, these cancel. And so then what we're left with is 3 over 2 is equal to 3 over 2 alpha. Again, we can just divide by 3 over 2 or multiply by 2 over 3 on both sides to get that alpha is now going to be equal to 1. And so let me sort of get rid of my sloppy handwriting and then show you sort of all of this out in a little bit prettier of a way. So so what happens if alpha is less than 1? Well, again, you know, French firms aren't, they won't necessarily offshore alpha equal to 1 because that would be the task at which they'd be perfectly indifferent. So one thing you could say is that France is still going to produce, France will produce basically this alpha equal to 1 task, and then Morocco is going to produce all of the other tasks. So if you're not familiar with this notation, this is open bracket notation. So this is what Morocco is producing. So it's producing everything from 0 to 1, where the 1 it doesn't include 1. So that is what Morocco will produce. Okay. And so again, it's important to note that this doesn't imply that France produces anything at all, since 1, we're only talking about intermediate goods. France may still produce a bunch of final goods, and it still may produce a bunch of commodities, such as you could think of like a commodity could be grapes for wine, for instance. And France still has a demand for both high and low skilled labor to produce those goods. But it is true that all of the tasks except for alpha equal to 1, Morocco is now going to produce. So they're going to produce basically most of the intermediate goods that are then going to be used in France. And so question 6 asks how this reduction in offshoring costs is going to affect the relative demand for high skilled labor in France, and how it's going to affect the high skilled labor the relative demand for high skilled labor in Morocco, and what's going to happen to the skill premium in both France and Morocco. And it asks us to illustrate those graphically. So, and this might differ a little bit from what's in the textbook, but I think it's useful. So what I'm gonna plot on the y-axis is I'm going to plot the relative wage of skilled workers to low skilled workers, or WH over WL, or the skill premium. And then I'm going to make two different plots for both France and Morocco. So let's call this France, and this is Morocco. And then what I want to do here is I want to think about, I could think about on the x-axis, what I want to have is I want to have the relative supply of skilled labor to unskilled labor in my country. And so, if we're thinking about, for instance, like any of the models we've seen before, where we're just, have a fixed endowment of skilled labor versus unskilled labor, then, we might have, oh, oops, sorry. I'm trying to draw a straight line there, and that was not very good. France has some fixed supply of high skilled workers to unskilled workers, and so this is going to be relative high skill labor supply, and likewise the same line is going to be the same for France. Okay, so France and Morocco, they both have some fixed amount of high skilled relative labor supply. The only way that they would, that sort of vertical line would change is if they have some increase or decrease in either the number of skilled or unskilled workers they have. And so, initially, there's some relative high skilled labor demand in both countries. And so I'm going to call this relative high skilled labor demand. And as I was saying at the onset of the section, from France's perspective, when the cost of offshoring, say, fell from having offshoring costs equal to 2 to 3.5, we had that now France offshored more tasks. But from the perspective of France, we're recalling that we had those tasks lined up from 0 to 1 in terms of how complex they were, how skill intensive they were. Then from France's perspective, the tasks that it lost were relatively low skill labor intensive. But from the perspective of Morocco, recall that when T was equal to 2, Morocco produced basically tasks from 0 to 1/3. And so, when trade costs were equal to this, it was producing these sets of goods. But then when we had trade costs fall to 1.5, Morocco goes from producing these goods into producing this entire set of goods. And so from Morocco's perspective, it's just gained all of the tasks from 1/3 to 1. And so from Morocco's perspective, all of those tasks it's gained have been high skilled labor intensive. Likewise for France, again, France was was producing initially it was producing all of the tasks from, sorry, I want to make these square brackets, from 1/3 to 1, and now it's just going to produce basically just good 1. And so from its perspective, it's losing relatively lower skilled labor intensive goods. And so we're going to see that in both countries we have a relative increase in high skilled labor demand. And so if we just read off the intersection that has for with the relative high skilled labor supply, that will tell us that, if we just read this off in terms of where it falls on the y-axis, we see that in both countries we have that the skill premium will increase. And I think this is a really interesting result, that basically sort of lowering trade costs in the offshoring model increases the skill premium, or you know, if you could think that the only difference between skilled workers and unskilled workers is that, say, skilled workers have, you know, gotten special skills, or gone to school, or gotten, you know, education or things like that, then, you know, what you can think of the skill premium as is like how much more I'd earn by investing those skills if I were an unskilled worker. And so I think it's an interesting result that sort of lowering those costs of offshoring actually leads it to sort of be, you know, increases the sort of benefit in terms of the skill premium. A less charitable way to frame that is that it also increases the difference between how, what the workers, wages of workers, low-skilled workers are earning, and then high-skilled workers. And so, you know, an alternative way to think of that is that it's also might be increasing inequality in both countries. So you could think of it as, you know, now education becomes more sort of more profitable, or you could think of it as we have an increase in inequality. And I think those both are sort of valid interpretations. And so then this is the slides here then stating what I showed earlier. And so we have basically in this model that there's an increase in the skill premium in both countries. So I just want to put into perspective a little bit of a discussion, and this is sort of a little bit more open-ended, but I want to talk a little bit about how sort of the offshoring model might compare a little bit to the say the Heckscher-Ohlin model that we've seen previously. And you know, it's a little bit difficult to sort of make an overly broad comparison between these two models because you know, different things are going on. But I want to just, you know, sort of without getting into too many of the details of how these models differ, I want to talk a little bit about, you know, how sort of the predictions about say inequality or increases in the skill premium you know, might change between the Heckscher-Ohlin model and in the offshoring model. So in the offshoring model, again, you know, this is what we just saw, so I won't summarize it too much. But in the offshoring model, say when trade / offshoring costs fall, costs fall, the skill premium increases in both countries, and increases in both countries. And I erased this here, but again, you want to have the skill premium, or equivalently the relative wage of high-skilled workers to low-skilled workers on the y-axis. But one of the points that I want to make is that, you know, we might have, and so, you know, we have this here. But one of the points I want to make is that we have a very different implication for the country that's low-skill labor abundant in the Heckscher-Ohlin model. And so in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, you know, France is a high-skilled labor abundant country, and so it will it will experience an increase in the skill premium when it opens to trade. But recall that again, we have that in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, Morocco is a low-skilled labor abundant country. So when it opens to trade, the relative price of the low-skilled labor-intensive good will increase, and that and because we have that now, relative labor demand is going to increase or shift towards low-skilled labor. So you know, when in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, when Morocco might open to trade, it's going to tend to specialize in the production of low-skilled tasks. And so that's the Heckscher-Ohlin. That's given by, excuse me, the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. Oops, sorry about that. Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. And so we have that Morocco is going to actually specialize in the production of. Sorry, I'm having technical issues here. Morocco is going to tend to specialize in the production of low-skilled tasks, which is going to shift economy-wide relative labor demand leftwards, because we now have lower demand for high-skilled labor, lower relative demand for high-skilled labor, and so in Morocco, the skill premium is going to decrease when we open to trade, whereas when we open up to trade in France, we have that France's skill premium is going to increase. And so the conclusion that the skill premium, or say inequality, increases in both countries is a conclusion that's only seen in the Ricardian model. But just to compare it to the Hector-Lean model, the Hector-Lean model says that when a skilled labor abundant country opens up to trade, inequality will increase, whereas when a unskilled labor abundant country opens up to trade, inequality will decrease. And so I think that's sort of an interesting difference between those two models. And in lecture, I think they talked a little bit about sort of the relative conclusions of both. So anyway, that's what I have. Does anyone have any questions?